Manassas, Virginia, a small, unassuming town where life moved at a pace most would describe as ordinary. Rows of modest homes lined quiet streets, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries in passing. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. But on the night of June 23, 1993, a single phone call shattered that illusion of tranquility. The details shared over that call would thrust this quiet town into the glare of national headlines and force a conversation about events that many found too shocking to comprehend. It began with a young woman named Lorena Bobbitt, 24 years old, fleeing her home in the dead of night, gripped by a desperation few could ever imagine. In her hand, she carried a kitchen knife, a knife that had already been used in a way no one could have foreseen. On that same night, her husband, 26-year-old John Wayne Bobbitt, stumbled into a hospital emergency room, drenched in blood, his injuries so severe that doctors struggled to grasp what they were dealing with. What unfolded next was a scene both bizarre and horrifying. Police officers scrambled to recover a discarded piece of flesh tossed from a speeding car, a piece that would be pivotal in one of the most notorious crimes in American history. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of a marriage, of pain, of years of alleged abuse. It is a story that asks difficult questions. What drives someone to the brink? How far can a person be pushed before they break? And what happens when justice, morality, and human suffering collide in a way that leaves no clear answers? Stay with us as we trace the events of that fateful night, the years that led up to it, and the explosive aftermath that would forever alter the lives of two people and captivate a nation. Manassas, Virginia, a town that prided itself on simplicity and community. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted attention. The lives of its residents, while varied, followed familiar routines. Among them were John Wayne Bobbitt and his wife, Lorena. John, a former Marine, was 26 years old. He was known for his confident demeanor, his all-American charm, and his easy laughter. Lorena, just 24, had come to the United States from Ecuador seeking a better life. She worked as a manicurist, soft-spoken and ambitious, dreaming of stability and prosperity in her adopted home. Together, they appeared to have the makings of a classic American story, a young couple striving for their version of happiness. But appearances can be deceiving. On the surface, their marriage was like any other. Moments of joy interspersed with the challenges of life. To their neighbors and friends, the Bobbitts seemed unremarkable. Yet, on the night of June 23, 1993, their private world would collide with the public eye in a way that defied comprehension. It was shortly after midnight when the emergency call came in. John Bobbitt had arrived at Prince William Hospital, severely injured, his condition critical. In the hours that followed, details began to emerge, details that seemed to come from the plot of a dark thriller, rather than the lives of an ordinary couple. Lorena had fled their shared home moments earlier, gripping a bloodied kitchen knife. She drove through the quiet streets of Manassas, her hands shaking, her mind racing. Somewhere along her route, she rolled down her car window and tossed something into the grass, something that investigators would later describe as a critical piece of evidence in a case that stunned the nation. For John, the urgency was survival. His injuries were unlike anything the hospital staff had ever encountered. Doctors and nurses worked frantically as police scrambled to understand what had happened. Their questions multiplied with every passing minute. Where was Lorena? Why had she done this? and what could have led to such an unthinkable act. This was no simple crime. This was a flashpoint, a culmination of events, emotions, and allegations that stretched far beyond that single night. It was a story of two lives intertwined, of promises made and promises broken. What could drive someone to commit such a desperate act? Was it vengeance, a cry for help, or something deeper, something impossible to untangle from the events that preceded it? Tonight, we look closer. We unravel the details piece by piece to understand the night that changed everything for John and Lorena Bobbitt. Lorena Gallo was born in 1969 in Bucay, Ecuador, a small town surrounded by lush greenery and modest homes. Like many in her community, Lorena grew up in a tight-knit family, bound by tradition and dreams of a brighter future. Even as a young girl, she was ambitious, hopeful for opportunities that would one day take her beyond the constraints of her small hometown. At the age of 18, Lorena's aspirations brought her to the United States. She arrived with little more than determination and a belief in the promise of the American dream. Settling in Virginia, she enrolled in community college and worked tirelessly as a nanny and later as a manicurist, sending money back to her family in Ecuador. For Lorena, the future was wide open, and she saw her life in America as a chance to build something enduring. It was in 1988, at a small social gathering, that Lorena met John Wayne Bobbitt. He was 21 years old, recently discharged from the Marine Corps and full of charisma. He spoke with confidence and had an easy smile that immediately drew Lorena in. For her, John represented stability, security, and the possibility of a life she had long dreamed of. For John, Lorena's kindness and gentle demeanor were magnetic. Their courtship was quick. Within months, they were married, and Lorena believed she had found her happily ever after. In the early days, their life together seemed filled with promise. Photographs from their wedding show a beaming couple, their faces full of hope and love. They settled in Manassas, Virginia, where John took on a series of odd jobs while Lorena continued her work as a manicurist. But as the months turned into years, the cracks in their relationship began to show. John, though charming, was prone to impulsivity and recklessness. Friends described him as someone who could be both the life of the party and a source of tension. His military discipline seemed to dissolve in civilian life, replaced by an increasingly volatile temperament. Lorena, on the other hand, struggled to reconcile the man she had fallen in love with and the one she now lived with. She spoke of arguments that escalated quickly, of feeling controlled and demeaned. She confided in close friends about the strain on their marriage, but rarely in detail, always hopeful that things could improve. Over time, the arguments became more frequent, the accusations sharper. Lorena alleged years of physical and emotional abuse. She described a household that was no longer a sanctuary, but a place of fear and unpredictability. John, however, denied these claims, asserting that their marriage faced the same struggles as any other. By the early 1990s, their relationship was defined by a toxic cycle of conflict and reconciliation. Lorena's friends noticed changes in her demeanor. The once optimistic young woman became withdrawn and quiet, her smile less frequent. John, meanwhile, faced mounting financial pressures and legal troubles, further straining their already fragile marriage. To outsiders, they were just another young couple, navigating the challenges of life. But those closest to them sensed that something was deeply wrong, a tension that couldn't be ignored. How could a relationship that began with so much promise deteriorate so completely? What was it about their dynamic that set the stage for the events of that fateful night in 1993? The answers lie in the stories they told, the conflicting accounts of their marriage, their struggles, and their pain. And in those stories, the seeds of what was to come were sown. It was late, well past midnight on June 23, 1993. The streets of Manassas were silent, the kind of quiet that settles in a suburban town when the world has gone to sleep. Inside the small apartment that Lorena and John Bobbitt called home, the tension of the day had given way to an uneasy stillness. Lorena was wide awake, her mind racing, her body tense. She would later recount in court that the events of that evening had pushed her to the brink. Earlier that night, she claimed, John had come home intoxicated. What followed, she alleged, was an assault, a harrowing experience that she said was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of abuse that had defined their marriage for years. John, meanwhile, denied these accusations, painting a very different picture of their relationship. But on this particular night, Lorena said, something shifted. The weight of those years, the fear, the anger, and the pain, they all came crashing down. As John slept soundly in their bed, Lorena found herself in the kitchen. The cool metal of the knife she picked up felt foreign and heavy in her hand. She claimed she wasn't thinking clearly, that her mind was a blur of emotion and instinct. The details of those moments remain shrouded in mystery. What she thought, what she felt. But what is known is that at 3 a.m., Lorena walked into the bedroom and committed an act that would shock the world. With a single motion, she severed John's penis. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but it was also silent, a silence filled with disbelief and panic. John awoke in pain and confusion, his screams cutting through the quiet night as he stumbled out of bed, blood soaking the sheets and the floor. Lorena stood, frozen for a moment, the knife still in her hand, before she grabbed her purse and keys and fled the apartment. She drove aimlessly, the enormity of what had just happened pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she tried to piece together her thoughts. Then, somewhere along her route, in a fit of desperation, or perhaps an attempt to erase the evidence of her actions, Lorena rolled down her car window, and she threw it out. The object she discarded would soon become the centerpiece of a frantic police search and a race against time to preserve a life. But in that moment, on the darkened streets of Manassas, Lorena simply kept driving, her heart pounding, and her mind a storm of panic and regret. Back at the apartment, John, bleeding profusely, managed to call a friend. Together, they drove to Prince William Hospital, where doctors and nurses were confronted with injuries they had never encountered before. As they worked to stabilize John, another team was mobilizing. Police officers tasked with finding what Lorena had thrown away. What they were searching for was no ordinary piece of evidence. It was an object that defied comprehension, discarded into the night like a piece of trash. But time was running out, and the success of their mission would determine whether this already unthinkable crime would end in an even greater tragedy. What could drive a person to commit such an act? And what did Lorena hope to achieve by fleeing into the darkness? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the search for the missing piece of John's life began. At 3:30 a.m., John Wayne Bobbitt stumbled into the hallway of his apartment building, his hands pressed desperately against his body in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. His cries for help echoed off the walls, rousing a neighbor who quickly called a mutual friend. Within minutes, the two men were in a car, racing through the quiet streets of Manassas toward Prince William Hospital. John was in shock, his body trembling, his mind unable to fully process what had just happened. He later described the car ride as a blur of flashing streetlights and overwhelming pain. His friend, equally horrified, drove with white knuckles, glancing over at John every few seconds, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. By the time they arrived at the hospital, the situation was critical. The ER staff, accustomed to emergencies, were unprepared for what awaited them. John stumbled through the automatic doors, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. He was immediately rushed into surgery, his survival hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, police were already on the move. Lorena had turned herself in shortly after the incident, admitting to what she had done, but offering few details. As officers pieced together her confession, they realized that something vital was missing, something that could mean the difference between life and death for John. The search began quickly and urgently. Officers combed the streets of Manassas, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their radios crackling with updates. Lorena had been cooperative, telling them where to look, but the sheer improbability of the situation left even seasoned detectives shaking their heads. What they were searching for wasn't just evidence, it was a part of the human body. Eventually, their efforts paid off. In a grassy field near a 7-Eleven convenience store, an officer's flashlight landed on an object that seemed out of place, small, flesh-colored, and impossibly out of context. The officer radioed in the discovery, his voice tinged with disbelief. The severed organ was carefully retrieved, placed in a hot dog bag from the store, and packed in ice. It was then rushed to the hospital with a police escort, the urgency of the situation palpable to everyone involved. Inside the hospital, a team of surgeons was already preparing for what would be a groundbreaking procedure. The 9.5-hour operation required precision, teamwork, and the kind of expertise that pushed the boundaries of modern medicine. Surgeons worked tirelessly, reconnecting nerves, blood vessels, and tissue with meticulous care. The stakes were enormous. This wasn't just about restoring physical function. It was about reclaiming a piece of humanity that had been violently taken away. As the hours ticked by, the operating room buzzed with tension, every movement calculated, every decision critical. Finally, as dawn broke over Manassas, the surgery was complete. Against all odds, the team had succeeded. John's organ had been reattached, and though his recovery would be long and fraught with challenges, the immediate danger had passed. News of the operation spread quickly, adding another layer of disbelief to an already unbelievable story. The medical team was hailed as heroes, their efforts a testament to the resilience of the human body and the skill of those who dedicate their lives to healing it. But for John, the journey was far from over. His physical recovery would be a grueling process, requiring months of follow-up care and therapy. And as his body began to heal, the weight of what had happened and what it meant settled heavily upon him. For those who witnessed the events of that night, one question lingered. How could something so shocking, so unprecedented, unfold in the life of a seemingly ordinary couple? And what did it mean for both of them moving forward? The courtroom was silent, save for the rustling of papers and the faint hum of a nearby air conditioner. Every seat was filled, and rows of reporters lined the back, their pens poised to capture the proceedings of a case that had already become a media sensation. At the center of it all were two people whose lives would now forever be defined by the events of a single night: John Wayne Bobbitt and Lorena Bobbitt. John was the first to stand trial, facing charges of marital sexual assault. Lorena's defense team painted a harrowing picture of abuse, detailing years of alleged violence, coercion, and control. They claimed that John's actions on the night of June 23, 1993, were the culmination of a pattern of behavior that had left Lorena feeling trapped and terrified. But John's defense told a different story. They described a marriage marked by mutual discord, denying the allegations of abuse and portraying Lorena as an unstable and vengeful spouse. Witnesses were called, testimonies given, and evidence presented, yet the case lacked the clarity needed for a conviction. In the end, the jury deliberated for hours before returning their verdict. Not guilty. For some, the verdict was a vindication, a declaration that the allegations against John were unproven. For others, it was a devastating blow, a reminder of how difficult it could be for survivors of abuse to find justice within the legal system. But John's trial was only the beginning. The focus soon shifted to Lorena, who now faced charges of malicious wounding, a crime that could result in years behind bars. As her trial began, the courtroom atmosphere was tense, the weight of public scrutiny palpable. Lorena's defense rested on a powerful argument that she had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, driven by years of abuse and the trauma of that fateful night. Psychologists testified about her mental state, describing the effects of sustained abuse and the psychological toll it had taken on her. The prosecution, however, argued that Lorena's actions were calculated, a deliberate act of revenge against her husband. They pointed to the methodical way she retrieved the knife, entered the bedroom, and carried out the act. They claimed that her flight from the scene and her later disposal of the organ demonstrated a clear intent to escape responsibility. As the trial unfolded, the nation watched, transfixed. Tabloid headlines screamed with sensationalized accounts of the case, while talk shows and news outlets debated its every detail. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Lorena as a victim pushed to her breaking point, a woman who had finally fought back against years of oppression. Others viewed her as a criminal who had committed an unthinkable act, regardless of the circumstances. The jury faced a monumental decision, one that would not only determine Lorena's fate, but also send a message about how society viewed cases of domestic violence and abuse. After days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered, not guilty by reason of insanity. The decision meant that Lorena would not face a lengthy prison sentence. Instead, she was committed to a psychiatric facility for 45 days, where she would undergo evaluation and treatment. For some, it was a fair outcome, recognizing the complexities of her mental state and the circumstances that had led to her actions. For others, it was a miscarriage of justice. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy continued unabated. The case became a cultural phenomenon, spawning countless articles, documentaries, and debates. It was a story that tapped into deep societal issues, the dynamics of power and control in relationships, the challenges faced by abuse survivors, and the ways in which the legal system grappled with such cases. For John and Lorena, the verdicts marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Their lives would never be the same, their names forever etched into the annals of true crime history. But the questions raised by their story, questions of justice, accountability, and the limits of human endurance, would linger long after the gavel fell. For John Wayne Bobbitt, the courtroom battles may have ended, but the repercussions of that night followed him relentlessly. As the dust settled on his acquittal, John found himself thrust into an unusual spotlight, one that he would both resent and embrace. In the months that followed, John attempted to capitalize on his newfound notoriety. Offers poured in from tabloids, talk shows, and an industry that saw his infamy as marketable. In a move that raised eyebrows across the country, John chose to step into the world of adult films. The decision was both a declaration and a deflection, an attempt to prove that the surgery had restored him physically, but also a bid to monetize a moment of humiliation. Titles like John Wayne Bobbitt, Uncut made headlines, sparking debate and ridicule in equal measure. For some, his foray into adult entertainment symbolized resilience. For others, it was a desperate grasp at relevancy. Yet, despite the initial shock value, John's brief stint in the industry did little to provide lasting stability. Legal troubles soon compounded his challenges. Over the years, John faced multiple accusations of violence and misconduct, tarnishing whatever image he had tried to rebuild. His attempts to reclaim control of his life were overshadowed by a series of arrests, financial struggles, and failed relationships. The shadow of that infamous night loomed large, shaping his every move and ensuring that he would never fully escape its grip. Meanwhile, Lorena Bobbitt's life took a markedly different turn. After her release from the psychiatric facility, Lorena chose to retreat from the public eye, at least for a time. The media circus had painted her as everything from a victim to a villain, and she needed space to rebuild. But Lorena's story didn't end in silence. Over the years, she began to emerge as an advocate, using her platform to shed light on the issue that had defined her case: domestic violence. She spoke openly about her experiences, not just in the courtroom, but in the marriage that had brought her to the brink. Lorena's bravery in recounting her past resonated with countless survivors, many of whom saw in her story a reflection of their own struggles. She founded the Lorena Gallo Foundation, dedicating her efforts to supporting survivors of abuse and raising awareness about the resources available to them. Through speaking engagements, interviews, and community work, Lorena reclaimed her narrative, turning a moment of infamy into a mission of empowerment. Still, the specter of sensationalism was never far away. For decades, her name was synonymous with tabloid headlines, late-night jokes, and lurid retellings of the crime. Yet Lorena persevered, determined to ensure that her story would be more than just a punchline. She reminded the world that behind the spectacle was a woman who had endured years of pain and who had found the strength to fight back, not just for herself, but for others like her. As the years passed, the stark contrasts between John and Lorena's post-trial lives became a subject of fascination. One sought fame and stumbled. The other sought peace and found purpose. Their paths diverged so dramatically that it was almost impossible to reconcile the fact that they had once shared a life together. But even in their separation, they remained tied by the event that had forever altered their destinies. For John, it was a source of endless notoriety, a chapter he could neither rewrite nor escape. For Lorena, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by resilience, advocacy, and the power of reclaiming a voice that had so often been drowned out. Their lives after the incident offer a poignant reflection on the human capacity to endure, adapt, and rebuild, but they also serve as a stark reminder of the ways in which our society grapples with trauma, justice, and the stories we choose to tell. The story of Lorena and John Wayne Bobbitt is more than a tale of one night's violent act. It is a mirror reflecting society's evolving understanding of justice, trauma, and survival. In the immediate aftermath, their case sparked a media frenzy unlike anything seen before. Late-night talk shows turned their pain into punchlines. Comedians built routines around the details, and tabloids plastered sensational headlines across front pages. It was entertainment for many, but beneath the spectacle was a reality far more unsettling. The trial forced conversations into living rooms across America. Conversations about domestic violence, the rights of women, and the boundaries of marital consent. For the first time, many were confronted with the stark realities of abuse that often went unspoken. Lorena's testimony about the years of physical and emotional torment she endured was shocking, not just for its content, but for the bravery it took to share it. Marital rape, a concept that had been dismissed or minimized for decades, became a central issue in the case. At the time, it was still a controversial topic in many states, with laws often providing husbands immunity from prosecution. Lorena's defense team highlighted this legal blind spot, forcing the nation to confront uncomfortable questions about power, control, and the sanctity of consent, even within the bounds of marriage. The case also ignited debates about justice and proportionality. Critics questioned whether Lorena's act was an extreme response, arguing that violence, even in retaliation, could not be justified. Supporters, however, saw her as a symbol of resilience, a woman who fought back against an overwhelming tide of abuse. But the impact of this story didn't end in the courtroom. Over the years, it seeped into the fabric of pop culture, referenced in television shows, movies, and even casual conversations. It became a shorthand for discussions about gender dynamics and the fine line between victimhood and agency. Yet for all its cultural ubiquity, the story was often reduced to its most sensational elements, a momentary act of violence stripped of the years of suffering that preceded it. Documentaries revisited the case with fresh perspectives, reframing Lorena not as a punchline, but as a survivor whose actions forced the world to pay attention to the plight of countless others. These retellings sought to remind audiences of the humanity at the heart of the story, challenging them to look beyond the headlines and see the deeper implications. Even now, decades later, the questions linger. Was Lorena a woman pushed beyond her limits, responding to a system that had failed to protect her, or was her act an unjustifiable crime, a step too far, no matter the circumstances? Can justice truly be served when the scales are tipped so heavily by fear, pain, and desperation? What does this case say about us? About the ways we view survivors of abuse? About the stories we choose to amplify? And about the silence we allow to persist in our own communities? For John and Lorena, the legacy of that night is inescapable. But for the rest of us, it is a reminder of the fragility of human relationships, the depth of the scars left by violence, and the enduring complexities of the human psyche. How do we define justice in a world where the lines are so often blurred between victim and perpetrator? It began as a story of two people, a young couple bound by vows, unraveling in the shadows of their home. But it ended as something far greater, a case that would ignite conversations about justice, accountability, and the very fabric of human relationships. For Lorena Bobbitt, the events of that fateful night were the culmination of years of pain, fear, and silence, a breaking point in a life marked by struggle. For John Wayne Bobbitt, it became a defining moment that would follow him forever, turning him into a figure of infamy and controversy. Their story isn't just about what happened on June 23, 1993. It's about what it revealed, the gaps in our understanding of abuse, the way trauma shapes decisions, and the lingering question of how we, as a society, treat those who cry out for help. The case left scars, not only on the individuals involved, but on the cultural landscape itself. It forced a nation to reckon with uncomfortable truths and drew a line in the sand between those who saw Lorena as a symbol of resilience and those who viewed her actions as indefensible. Even now, the story feels unfinished. Its echoes can be heard in the ongoing fight against domestic violence, in the shifting conversations about consent and power, and in the growing recognition that behind every headline is a story far more complex than we may ever fully know. And so, we leave you with this. Was this an act of desperation, a cry for justice in the face of unrelenting pain? Or was it something else, a decision made in the heat of anguish that transcends the boundaries of right and wrong? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. What do you think? Was justice served, or does this story leave you questioning where the line is drawn between victim and perpetrator? Let us know in the comments below. And if you've been captivated by the twists and turns of this chilling case, there's much more where this came from. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss another journey into the darkest corners of the human experience. Because here, on True Crime Files, every story has a lesson, and every lesson leaves us with more questions than answers.